Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Macri, fantasy analyst here at PFF, and it's another Waiver Wire Tuesday, also known as Patrick Kane signs with the Detroit Red Wings Day. But we're also heading into these crucial final 2 weeks of the fantasy regular season that are going to be huge for a lot of fantasy managers. So here to break down all the top waiver targets, PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, how's it going, sir?
It's going well. It was a pretty good week. Did well in plenty of my fantasy leagues, including the Scott Fish Bowl. Very easily advanced to the next round of the Scott Fish Bowl, so I was happy with that. Had Roshan Johnson get above 6.5 receiving yards very early in that game and well exceeded it in the first quarter, so was happy to see that at least. Unfortunately, DJ Moore did not score his touchdown despite catching 11 passes for over 100 yards, so I went with you. I also went with DJ Moore scoring a touchdown because I was not including him in my showdown lineup. So that just all didn't work out for me. But at least I got Johnson over 6.5 receiving yards.
Yeah, at least we had that. It wasn't a great night for really anytime touchdown bettors across the board, other than TJ Hawkinson, right? It was another
Mhm.
field goal party here on Monday Night Football. The Bears win it 12-10. It was a game that happened. I'll say that. So we'll see if there's any fantasy implications from it. Yeah, like you said, DJ Moore had a nice game, 11 catches, 114 yards on 3 targets. So that was always nice. Cole Kmet also heavily involved in the Bears offense, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 43 yards. But the other bit of Chicago news here in the offense is that we had a bit of a shift in the backfield, Nate, with Roshan Johnson and Khalil Herbert. What happened there?
Yeah. First off, Deontay Foreman, who has been heavily involved in this backfield and active for this game with both an ankle and shin injury. The Bears do have their bye week this upcoming week, so a decent chance that Foreman could be back after the bye week. But between Johnson and Herbert, we did see Herbert start the game, but Johnson was pretty much the main running back over the course of the rest of the game, which was a bit surprising considering Herbert's playing time even last week coming back from injury. He saw a decent amount of work on early downs, and Johnson has pretty well established himself as the receiving back for Chicago. It did seem like Chicago, their game plan was pretty much to throw the ball a lot, almost immediately abandon the run altogether. The Vikings have been one of the best teams at preventing rushing yards to running backs this season, both in terms of rushing yards per game, rushing yards per attempt. So, not all that surprising that Chicago focused on the pass. So, some of this could have just been the game plan that they knew they were going to be passing the ball, so leave their receiving back on the field almost all of the time. But it could just be that they think Johnson is ready to have a bigger role in the rushing game, and he ran the ball significantly in the second half of the game. So Herbert also still got on the field here and there, still ran the ball a couple of times, and I don't think Johnson was all that more effective of a runner as Herbert in this game, but I think it'll be something where Chicago does have their bye week, and then after that point, they do have a pretty rough stretch of games: Detroit, Cleveland, Arizona, and Atlanta over the course of the rest of the fantasy season. 3 of those 4 have been fairly good at stopping fantasy running backs this season, and if it's a 3-man committee, that's not great. But we are going to be talking about waiver wires later, and Johnson, just by the fact that he played roughly 75% of the offensive snaps, there's not going to be many running backs that you can get off the waiver wire that at least have a chance to play the majority of their team's offensive snaps without an injury in their next game. So just by default, Johnson is one of the top waiver wire running backs, even though his schedule is not great and he has a bye week next week.
Yeah, it's hard to ignore that usage, right? And that's kind of going to be the main thing here, and is the volume that we're after, and we'll see what happens coming out of their bye week. Obviously, we won't know this week since they're off, but it's something at least to kind of keep in mind here, because that is a pretty significant shift towards Roshan Johnson as far as the usage goes. So we'll see if Khalil Herbert was banged up or still not 100% or what, but definitely some encouraging numbers at least for Roshan Johnson's purposes. Anything else for the Chicago offense for you, or would you rather talk about Minnesota?
Oh, yeah, I have a little note, even though it didn't really matter for fantasy this week and probably won't for this year. But Tyler Scott, the Bears' fourth round rookie wide receiver, has had a pretty significant role at times this season. He was their third wide receiver when Equanimous St. Brown was on injured reserve. And then over the previous 2 weeks, when St. Brown was back, we saw a bit of rotation where Tyler Scott was still getting pretty heavily involved, rotating in for not just St. Brown, but also for Darnell Mooney. So Mooney, who's been a pretty big disappointment for fantasy football purposes this season anyway, Mooney started seeing his playing time decline, but in this game, Scott was back to his role early in the season. If anything, he was playing fewer snaps than he was playing at the start of the season. That left St. Brown seeing his usual amount of playing time that he would have seen before landing on injured reserve. Also left Mooney seeing his usual amount of playing time of what he was seeing before these previous 2 weeks. So um, Mooney only caught 2 passes for 6 yards. St. Brown and Scott were not targeted. So this doesn't matter all that much for fantasy leagues if none of those wide receivers outside of DJ Moore are going to see any targets. But at least Mooney is seeing the playing time again that he was seeing earlier, that there's a chance he could see more targets, but it seems like a long shot at this point.
Fair. All right. And then on the Viking side of things, still no Justin Jefferson, unfortunately. And then Josh Dobbs throws 4 interceptions. So that was also unfortunate. But TJ Hawkinson, 50 yards and a touchdown. Outside of that, anything from Minnesota worth talking about here, Nate?
The Vikings backfield, it was the same kind of stuff that we've been seeing all season. We saw Madison see double the snaps of Chandler last week. And then this week, it was pretty much back to a rotation. There were some drives where it was one running back for the entire drive, other drives were both running backs all time. So, no really clear pattern of what they were doing as usual. Over the first half of the game, Chandler ended up with one more snap than Madison, largely because there was one drive in particular that Chandler was on the field for, and that was a longer drive. But then in the second half, Madison started breaking a few longer runs. So Madison was playing decently well to start the third quarter. So he ended up with a bit more playing time in the second half of the game. So right now it's Madison in the lead, but the Vikings have their bye week next week as well. Wouldn't be surprised if Chandler again gets decently involved next week and is just a case of if one of these running backs gets really hot, there's a chance that they could win the starting job outright. But so far that hasn't happened for either running back.
All right. So there you go. That is our Monday Night Football recap. And like you said, both teams heading into a bye week here in week 13. And hopefully that means Justin Jefferson is coming back after the bye week. We could at least hope for the fantasy playoffs. So, all right. Before we get into the waiver wire targets, a quick shout out to our presenting sponsor, Fabric by Gerber Life. Fall is all about the back to school and back to routine checklist, and the most important task on that list should be securing your family's financial future, starting with life insurance. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it quick, easy, and affordable to protect your family so you can get back to enjoying life. Fabric was designed by parents for parents to help you get a high quality, surprisingly affordable term life insurance policy in less than 10 minutes. Fabric has flexible policies that fit your family and your budget, with quality policies like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Get your personalized quote in just minutes and then apply when it's convenient for you. It's all online and on your schedule. You can go from start to covered in less than 10 minutes with no health exam required. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. MEET fabric.com/fantasy. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions. All right, Nate, we're getting to that point now in the season. We're just 2 short weeks away from the fantasy playoffs. Not a great time if you plan on taking your foot off the gas, so you're making those rosters vulnerable at the most crucial part of the season here. We're going to lock up some depth, develop some backup plans, make those rosters ironclad heading into the final stretch here. Waivers are going to be a key part of that. So, Nate, let's get into it. Start off at the quarterback position, as we always do, and kick things off with the hero of Thanksgiving, Jordan Love, who was robbed of a sideline turkey, by the way, after throwing for 3 touchdowns on Thanksgiving and defeating the Lions. Fox did this man dirty. So the least we can do is add him off the waiver wire and make him a part of a fantasy football championship roster. Nate, the man deserved a turkey leg.
Yeah, I have plenty of good things to say about Love, but I do want to summarize this week with waivers in general because I think it's a really weird week for waivers. There are 6 teams on bye week, so fantasy managers are probably more desperate than usual to find some waiver wire targets. And this week, it's a lot of the same names that we've been talking about. There'll be one or two guys at each position that are available in just over 50% of ESPN leagues. So the very best players we're talking about might not be available in your league, but it's at least worth checking. We're including some guys that are specifically because there's 6 teams on bye weeks, but it's not great options. And then there were plenty of players who had good weeks this past week, like Tyler Higbee scored 2 touchdowns, Jalen Hyatt over 100 receiving yards. But there are guys like that where we've seen exactly what they've done all season long. It's pretty clear that this last week was the anomaly and it's not a trend of things to come, since Higbee's playing time didn't change, his yards and targets didn't change. He just happened to find the end zone twice. Jalen Hyatt all season long has been more of a deep threat. There have been games where he's done basically nothing. There's been games where he's made one big play. It was just in this game he was able to make more than one big play. So there are guys like that who had big games that we're not including because we don't expect them to continue. So a lot of guys where it's very important to pay attention to what your roster needs and pick waivers accordingly. But like you said, with Jordan Love, excellent game this past week. 268 yards, 3 touchdowns. And the big thing is his PFF grade was the best it's been all season. And really, these past 4 weeks have been much better than they were early in the season. An 84 grade over the past 4 weeks compared to 65.2 over the first 8 weeks. So I think this has been pretty dependable, what we've been seeing out of Love. At least 18 fantasy points the last 3 weeks. And the Packers have a relatively nice schedule over the rest of the season. It'll be a rough game against Kansas City this upcoming week, but after that point, it should be some fairly good matchups where he can be in fantasy starting lineups. So Love, hopefully, in a lot of leagues, you've listened to us the past couple weeks and already picked him up, but if not, now is the probably last time that you'll be able to get him.
Yeah, it's been nice to see the improved play. We talked about that the last week as well, and it just has continued here. So nice to see for Jordan Love, and you never know. It looks like Christian Watson may be coming alive now as well. He had his best game of the season, touchdowns in back-to-back games for him. Jaden Reed's balling out. Romeo Doubs all of a sudden touchdown magnet this year, even though he didn't get one on Thursday, but still. These guys have all been clicking, so really nice to see there for Jordan Love and the Packers. All right, next up, another quarterback with some really good weapons to throw to and history of big-time performances as well, rostered in just 31% of leagues, Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams.
Yeah, Stafford had a pretty interesting game through the 4 touchdown passes with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp both on the injury report. Both of them play their usual amount, but only combined for 7 receptions for 45 yards. It was a lot of Kyron Williams, a lot of Tyler Higbee scoring the touchdowns, and then Tutu Atwell, like we were talking about yesterday, ended up leading the team in receiving yards with a couple big plays. But Stafford is really someone who has very consistently been outside of the top 14 fantasy quarterbacks week in and week out. He's just thrown a decent amount of yards and thrown a touchdown or two. So he's been very consistent most of the time, just not consistently above that top 12 mark for a quarterback. Has 2 very rough matchups these next few weeks against the Browns and the Ravens, the top 2 teams at preventing fantasy points to quarterbacks. So the one reason he is on this list is because that first week of the fantasy playoffs, he's going up against the Washington Commanders, who have allowed the most points to fantasy quarterbacks. So Stafford was almost like those guys I was just talking about a minute ago, of guys that we've seen what they can do all season, just happen to have a good week. But I am leaving him on this list because he does play the Commanders, so he has a chance of being a fantasy starter, specifically that first week of the playoffs. So if you are looking a little ahead to who you might be starting in future weeks and know specifically you need a quarterback for that week, Stafford, someone to consider.
Yeah, I like this one as like a matchup dependent play, right? And like you said, tough matchups the next 2 weeks, but a very favorable one here in week 15. And I wrote about him in the O-line, D-line matchups to target and avoid this past week as well, because he has been a decent matchup dependent quarterback at times and had his best fantasy game of the season this year. And their offensive line too has been playing better as of late too, and can take advantage of some positive matchups. So Washington being one of those teams who now doesn't have Chase Young and Montez Sweat rushing off the edge, that could be an advantage for them as well in week 15. So Nate, another quarterback that we've talked about a few times on this show the last few weeks is Derek Carr of the New Orleans Saints, rostered in 22.7% of ESPN leagues.
Yeah, he's another one of those quarterbacks that's been fairly consistent, just a little ahead of Stafford for most of the season. Um, Fairly consistently in the top 10 to 15 range among fantasy quarterbacks week in and week out. And we've been talking about him for probably a month now just because of his schedule. Probably has one of the better matchups this week against the Detroit Lions, where Detroit has allowed the sixth most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season, and Detroit's been winning most of their games. So a lot of teams are throwing a lot late in games, which has been helping. So this looked like a great time for Carr a week ago, but then Carr lost Michael Thomas to injured reserve, and then Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed both injured this past week, and there's a decent chance that they don't have any of their top three wide receivers for this game. Despite that, Carr is probably still one of the better options if you are desperate for a quarterback this week. The wide receiver options aren't great, but they still have the tight ends they can throw to. They still have Alvin Kamara that Carr can throw to. So Carr's been able to make things work with pretty random wide receivers at points throughout his career. Like Stafford, Carr does not have any of that any rushing potential whatsoever. So he's not going to have that like top 6, top 8 upside. But if you need a fantasy quarterback for this week or have other points in the season where you need a quarterback, Carr is probably someone you can look to.
Yeah, like you said, 6 teams on a bye this week. So plus all the injuries at quarterback, desperate times, right? And Derek Carr has been solid at least, and hopefully gets his wide receivers back. I don't know about Chris Olave; at least shouldn't be a long-term injury. But Rashid Shaheed, we'll see what happens there as well. But nice having that deep threat in the lineup if he's available. Last quarterback here, Nate, Gardner Minshew, rostered in just 7% of ESPN leagues. Another one we talked about for a couple of weeks and may not have thrown a touchdown this past week, but he did rush one in after juking Devin White out of his cleats and getting in the end zone there. So that was cool to see. And someone with a nice fantasy schedule here in the final weeks of the season, too.
Yeah, someone that I feel like's been on this list for at least the last 2 months at this point. Got Josh Downs back, which was great to see as well. Targeted Downs a lot, didn't end up with a ton of receptions, but I think that'll help the offense going forward. And like you said, the schedule is the big thing for him. He's been kind of inconsistent from one week to the next in terms of his fantasy production, but I always like to include at least someone available in over 90% of ESPN leagues, and Minshew has pretty consistently been the clear guy that I would trust if you are in one of those leagues where the guys that we usually talk about are taken. 3 of Indianapolis's next 4 opponents have allowed a decent amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. This includes and the fantasy playoffs going up against Atlanta, who have allowed the 5th most points. So some pretty good matchups ahead. So that's the big thing with him. Plus, his receivers have been getting more healthy recently. So I think with the healthy receivers, he should be able to have some good performances in the playoffs. But again, ideally, you aren't desperate for a quarterback at this point. Haven't had a ton of quarterback injuries, at least this week. So hopefully you don't need a quarterback. But if you do and are in one of those leagues where most are taking, Minshew's the guy.
There you go. All right, let's head to the running backs now, and a few good ones available here. And we'll start at the top. Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers, rostered in 48.5% of ESPN leagues, so just under that 50% threshold, but still pretty widely available, and has been showing some promising numbers here as far as playing time and everything goes. So, what do we like about Chuba Hubbard, Nate?
Yeah, he was recently dropped in a number of leagues since Miles Sanders had slowly but surely crept back up to 50% of offensive snaps. But in this game, Raheem Blackshear was a healthy and active, so that was the first good thing to see that they only wanted 2 running backs on the active roster, so that kind of helped the floors of both players. And then we saw Chuba Hubbard outsnap Miles Sanders in most situations outside of short yarded situations. So saw over 20 snaps more, so close to 2-to-1 split, which was good to see, especially Hubbard taking the goal line snaps. And this was kind of the opposite of what we saw last week. Last week it was Sanders seeing the goal line snaps and Hubbard getting the short yarded situation. So both players are capable of doing both. A lot of teams, when they have a running back rotation where the running backs are used kind of interchangeably, it's a rotation by drive, but we've seen Carolina kind of rotate every couple of plays what these 2 running backs are doing. And like we mentioned at the end of the podcast yesterday, Carolina did fire head coach Frank Reich. They made other changes on the coaching staff as well, including firing the running backs coach. So we could see some changes in how they are using their running backs going forward. But considering Miles Sanders had connections to both Deuce Staley and Frank Reich with their time in Philadelphia, if anything, I'd expect Hubbard to be more of the clear guy now that some people that were advocates for Miles Sanders are no longer on the coaching staff.
Yeah, makes sense. And like you said, Hubbard obviously getting back up to 64% of snaps this past week. He was closer to that 50% range the past couple of weeks with Miles Sanders in there. But it does help that he's played better than Sanders. He's been more efficient pretty much across the board, right? Better yards per carry, better yards after contact per attempt, better explosive run rate, better yards per route run as a receiver as well. So everything kind of pointing in favor of Chuba Hubbard, and we'll see if the coaching staff kind of leans into him a little bit more now. So definitely promising stuff there for Chuba Hubbard. All right, next up, popular name from a few weeks ago, Baltimore's Keaton Mitchell, who is rostered in 33.6% of ESPN leagues. He definitely set the bar high in week 9, has been relatively quiet compared to that, but he has seen his role steadily increase in each week since then, and may very well continue to rise after the team's bye week this coming week. So, Nate, how are we feeling about Keaton Mitchell going forward?
Feeling pretty good. It's been a pretty linear increase in snaps each week. Played roughly 50% of early down snaps a week ago, and now he's over 50% of snaps. Has been really cutting into Gus Edwards' playing time. Justice Hill also cut into Edwards' playing time specifically on third down. So it's Edwards that's really getting a little bit more phased out of the offense. Mitchell played well, has averaged 6 yards or more per carry in 3 of his games this season. Edwards has only done that twice this season. So it's been pretty clear that Mitchell's been the more effective running back than Edwards. But it's been Baltimore trying to get more comfortable with having Mitchell as their main running back. And it seems like they're slowly but surely getting more comfortable. And like you said, with the bye week this week, that gives them even more time to get Mitchell more involved in the offense. I think it would be huge if he starts to get more involved in passing situations, since Justice Hill hasn't done a ton as a receiver, and Mitchell has made a couple of big plays, not necessarily this past week, but previous weeks in the passing game. So possible we see Mitchell take a bigger role there. So someone who has slowly but surely reached the point where he's probably a top 30 fantasy running back just based on what we know about his playing time. But I think the potential is still there for him to take a much bigger role in this offense. So that's what we've kind of been banking on since we've started talking about him, as his role keeps expanding, and yet might not have it be expanding as quick as some fantasy managers might like, but it's been a pretty nice progression each and every week since he joined the active roster.
Yeah, like you said, the progression in snaps has been very clear. And look, the team's going to have a bye week, so hopefully it's a little bit of a bigger jump after that. If we can get into that 60 to 65% of snap range, obviously that would make us feel a lot more comfortable about starting him. And he's been explosive and efficient, so we obviously love that. Even if he isn't necessarily getting those snaps, if we have to play him, he could break off a nice big play every once in a while there too. So. Next names on the list, a couple that we already covered here at the top. Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears, rostered in 22% of ESPN leagues, and Ty Chandler of the Minnesota Vikings, rostered in 45% of ESPN leagues. So we did talk about them at the top. We don't necessarily have to dive too deep into them here, Nate, but maybe we could talk about a player that we kind of touched on yesterday of the New England Patriots. It's Ezekiel Elliott. So we talked about Ramondre Stevenson's kind of growing role, or at least his role coming back to what we were kind of hoping for Ramondre Stevenson last week. So what do we still like about Ezekiel Elliott here going forward?
We mostly like his matchup this upcoming week. Like we mentioned, there's 6 teams on a bye week, and there are a number of players that we were just talking about that are part of those players that have a bye week this week. So I wanted to make sure that I included at least one player who's available in at least 60% of ESPN leagues, that if you are desperate for a running back this week for whatever reason, Elliott's the best of a lot of bad options, basically. Since it's been a weird year it's been a weird in a good way year for running backs, in that not a lot of running backs have been getting and staying injured. We saw J.K. Dobbins and Nick Chubb at the very start of the season, But those are the two main running backs that at this point of the season are injured. Aaron Jones has had the lingering injury for a while. So Jones is the other player who we don't know what his status is. But outside of that, most backfields have been relatively healthy. And a lot of the rookie running backs were getting involved in the offense early in the season. So we really haven't had the running backs that are available off the waiver wire like we have in past years, where each week it seems like someone's injured. So there's this backup running back that's a huge waiver wire ad. And we haven't had that for a few weeks now. So Elliott, we were talking about him yesterday because his role has been decreasing, not staying on the field for too many plays at a time. Ramondre Stevenson taking all of the third down work, all of the 2-minute drill work. And so Elliott is largely just restricted to every other drive on early downs, as long as it's not the 2-minute drill. But that's still been enough time for him to run the ball at least a decent amount of times each game. Ran 9 times for 46 yards and caught 2 passes for 6 yards this past week against a Giants defense. And this week faces the Los Angeles Chargers, and the Chargers have allowed plenty of fantasy points to running backs this season. They don't have the greatest record, so the Patriots should at least be able to stay close in this game. If not, like, I expect the Chargers to win, but there's a chance the Patriots could end up winning the game, even with the quarterback situation where we don't know who's going to be starting at quarterback. But because of the quarterback situation, they are relying even more on the run game. So even though Stevenson is the clear top guy at this point, probably a top 10 rest of season running back, but Elliott is getting enough time that you should see almost double-digit carries. There's a chance he sees double-digit carries if the game script is going the right way this week. So I know that's not great. There are plenty of other running backs that I'd rather be starting this week. But if you are looking at the waiver wire, the guys that we already talked about, or specifically just Chuba Hubbard, if Hubbard isn't available, then I think Elliott's probably going to be the best option available on the waiver wire.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that makes perfect sense. And yeah, like you said, not a lot of injuries at the running back position this year. Hopefully you didn't jinx that. If you did, I know who to talk to if I lose one of my starting running backs here. But in case you did, we do have a number of handcuff running backs as well that we can look to target. And again, like, if you have the starters on these teams, you want to make sure that you have the backups as well at this point in the season here, to make sure that those rosters have no holes and that you can have the next man up if needed. So a few names here that we've touched on a couple times on this show, but Tajay Spears of the Tennessee Titans rostered in 34.5% of ESPN leagues. Kenneth Gainwell of the Philadelphia Eagles rostered at 15.6%. Let's start with those two first, Nate. Anything else that you want to expand upon for those two backup running backs?
I don't think I have much because we've talked about them the last couple weeks. They haven't really been doing all that much in their offenses currently. This is completely about if there is an injury to a starter and you're in a league where you have a decent amount of bench spots, and we have bye weeks this week, but if you've reached a point where some of the backups on your roster, if you're not going to be playing them again at any point this season, almost regardless of the situation, a lot of backup quarterbacks or tight ends or just wide receivers who are starters, just not as good as the other starters you have on your roster, then it's better to use your bench spots for players who have a chance to be a fantasy star if something happens. So with Tajay Spears, if something were to happen to Derrick Henry, then Spears would be the clear guy. He's been playing very well in his limited opportunities, and the Titans have a great schedule. They play the Houston Texans twice during the fantasy playoffs, so plenty of opportunities for Spears in those games. And similarly, Gainwell, the Eagles play the Seahawks, Giants, and Cardinals, all or two of those 3 games where the Eagles should have pretty big leads and should be able to run the ball a ton. So should be great games for DeAndre Swift. But if something were to happen to Swift and he were to get injured, and he does have that history of injuries, then it would be Gainwell who's the clear starter in Philadelphia and getting all these opportunities. So both guys who I think could be top 10 fantasy running backs if something were to happen to the starter. Just if the starter stays healthy, then they aren't going to do anything fantasy football wise.
Yeah, Makes sense. And then a couple of other names here for deeper leagues as well. Leonard Fournette of the Buffalo Bills rostered in 5.6% of leagues, and Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders available in 99% of leagues. So again, we know Zamir White being that handcuff for Josh Jacobs potentially. We haven't seen Leonard Fournette yet this season, but like you said a couple episodes ago, there's at least the potential there that he works in. So anything else to add for these two guys?
White's the exact same category as the two guys we just
Yeah.
talked about. It's just he's available in more leagues, so try to have different players that are available in different amounts of leagues. And then Fournette's interesting. There was a report a little over a week ago that he was going to have big time consideration to be called up for that game. Was not caught up for that game. Was not caught up this past week from the practice squad. So don't really know exactly what the Bills are waiting for, or Fournette's just not looking all that great on the practice squad, or maybe they just want to keep him as fresh as they can for the end of the season. But the Bills are at this point almost on the outside looking in on the playoffs, so they can't really save him for the playoffs if they're not going to make the playoffs. So he's been on this list for a couple weeks now. He's been slowly but surely moving down this list. So it'll be interesting to see if he does get caught up from the practice squad at some point. But there's just, like I was saying before, so few options of running backs who look like they could become fantasy starters at some point without an injury. Fournette's just one of the probably the longest shot of the guys we mentioned, but just someone who could become the starter on their team without an injury. But there's not that many of those situations. So Fournette, at least someone worth considering, especially if a lot of the guys we talked about are already on rosters.
Yeah, makes sense. The Bills 6-6. It'll be hard to be playoff Lenny if they can't get in, but maybe he could be fantasy playoff Lenny if he does get a chance here in the next few weeks. But all right, before we go on to the wide receivers, I want to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is a skill-based, real money daily fantasy sports game. How does it work? You pick 2 to 6 players. If they will go more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can get up to 25 times your money on any entry. So I'll start us off here. And I picked Ramondre Stevenson going over 57.5 rushing yards. Nate, we talked about him yesterday on the podcast, his usage kind of increasing here a little bit. We like the matchup against the Chargers, who aren't as bad against the run as they were last year, but still just about league average in that regard. So it's a nice matchup for them. For Stevenson, Chargers giving up 4.2 yards per carry. Ramondre Stevenson has had over 85 rushing yards in 3 straight games heading into this week now. So like the chances here for him to kind of go over 57.5 rushing yards. How about you?
I will also go with the rushing yards, but I will go with DeAndre Swift, less than 56.5 yards, going up against the 49ers defense. Swift has gotten at least 57 rushing yards in most games this season, but the Eagles really have been in a lot of close games, but their one loss is the time that Swift only had 18 rushing yards. In 2 other close games, he was have less than 56.5 rushing yards, and they are going up against the 49ers defense, who have allowed the fewest rushing yards so far this season. Wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the worst game scripts that the Eagles have had this season. So one where they should be passing the ball a lot more, or at least Jalen Hurts dropping back to pass and potentially running the ball. Kenneth Gainwell is still rotating in a decent amount of the time. So Swift, that's still been enough for him to get double-digit carries, often closer to 14 or 15 carries. But there's been some games where he hasn't been running the ball as much, particularly when they played Kansas City. And that great game, he only ran the ball 12 times. He did a great job running the ball, and those 12 times got 76 rushing yards. But I could see this being a game where he's not running the ball as much as usual, and facing a run defense that has been doing a great job at stopping the run. So could see Swift very well not having as big of a game and them relying a lot more on their passing options.
Makes sense. At Prize Picks, you aren't competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections. Go to prizepicks.com/PFF fantasy and use code PFF fantasy for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/PFF fantasy and use code PFF fantasy for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, let's move to the wide receiver position, where there are some solid options here to consider. And starting with Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers, rostered in 31.5% of ESPN leagues. Nate, we still very much like Jayden Reed, and he's still pretty widely available.
Yeah, he's someone that I've struggled with for a number of weeks just because I was having a hard time seeing kind of the path forward for Reed since he's been a consistent role, their slot wide receiver all season long, but Romeo Dobbs had been scoring plenty of touchdowns. Christian Watson's still there. A big thing is Luke Musgrave, who has been their tight end, who has been also making big plays in the middle of the field. He is on injured reserve. We're not sure if he will return to the Packers this season. So Reed was someone who put up big numbers in a couple games, but I wanted to see it a little bit more consistently, and he's been doing it more consistently. Scored a touchdown on Thanksgiving, third straight game that he's done well, and a big part of this as well is Jordan Love, who we were talking about at the start of the show. He's been playing a lot better and a lot more consistently recently in the season. So Reed was seeing a decent amount of targets throughout the year, just not always quality targets. And now those targets are starting to be a little bit higher quality. He's also running the ball more, only ran the ball twice over the first 10 weeks of the season. Ran the ball twice this past week, 3 times the week before. So also starting to have a higher floor because he's running with the football. So I think he's someone who he's scored, I think, the 11th most fantasy points since week 7, which has been great. So I think Reed is someone that, even though the Packers have other wide receiver options on the outside, he's someone that I'm really starting to trust at this point. And like you can see, if you're watching right now, his big playability has been huge this season among some very good wide receivers, and how often he's been getting 30-yard plays based on his routes run.
Yeah, he's been great, and like you said, his involvement in the offense has been nice, and it's helped potentially him with Aaron Jones out, getting some options there to run the ball as well. And 27% target rate in week 12. He's had over 20% target rate in 3 of his last 4 games. So really nice numbers there for Jaden Reed if we're looking to put him into lineups here. And then another rookie slot wide receiver who we liked quite a bit, also paired with one of our waiver wire quarterbacks here for the home stretch, is Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. So rostered in 47% of ESPN leagues. Josh Downs had his snaps go back up this week coming out of the bye as well.
Yeah, he's another one of those players that was taken in at least 50% of leagues just a couple weeks ago, but he had slowly but surely been getting dropped from leagues. The Colts or Down suffered an injury in week 9. His playing time was very restricted in week 10, even though he played, and then the Colts had their bye week in week 11. So a 3-week stretch where he was no longer fantasy relevant. But from weeks 5 to week 8, he scored 66.5 PPR points, which ranked 11th among wide receivers. So was playing very well before the injury. Saw plenty of targets this past week. Didn't get quite as many catches as we would have liked to see, but I think he is capable of rebounding to be the player that he was before the injury, when he was scoring plenty of fantasy points. And like we said earlier, the Colts have a fairly good schedule over the rest of the season. So I think Downs is capable of being a fantasy starter again, but he also and taken in a lot of leagues. So someone just to see if he was dropped by whomever in your fantasy league over the past week or two.
Yeah, like you said, 13 targets in week 12, and obviously just the 5 catches. But like you said, there's also a favorable match schedule here going forward. So, I mean, 13 targets, we can't ask for more than that. It should be continuing to be heavily involved there in the offense, which we love to see. Another player who's also been heavily involved in the offense here is Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots, rostered in 31.8% of leagues. He's dealing with a possible concussion, obviously. So, not sure what his status is going to be for this week, but still somebody that we like here rest of season, Nate.
Yeah, was fairly consistently the top wide receiver we were mentioning, but the injury has knocked him down a little bit. He was targeted 9 times for the second straight week, caught 6 passes for a second straight week, and then missed the fourth quarter due to a concussion he suffered on a punt return. So he very well could miss the next game, but I would expect him back sometime later, or hopefully he just misses the one game and is back for the rest of the season. Simply the Patriots' top wide receiver. He's been seeing targets regardless of who's at quarterback. So generally, the top wide receiver for teams should be on fantasy rosters, and I think Douglas fits that description. So not someone who can help you if you're looking for a wide receiver this week, most likely. Although if he does end up playing, facing the Chargers, that should be a fairly good matchup for him. So if he does play, then I think he is someone who could be in fantasy starting lineups, but not expecting him this week. So more so picking him up for what he can do over the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, 41% target rate before he went out, 31% the week prior. Definitely a big part of that offense whenever it does become a real offense. There's definitely potential there for Demario Douglas. All right, let's talk about an interesting rookie option who hasn't quite popped just yet, but a second round pick. There's some potential there for sure. Nate, Jonathan Mingo of the Carolina Panthers, rostered in 7.6% of ESPN leagues.
Oh yeah, he's someone who's been on this list before just because he's been a starter for Carolina the entire season, consistently playing at least 90% of offensive snaps, but his target share has just been fairly low in a number of games this season. But he is coming off his best game, 60 receiving yards, caught 4 of 6 passes thrown his way. So that was a step in the right direction. And like we've been saying all podcasts, there are 6 teams on bye weeks this week. And some of the guys that we've talked about either might not be available in your league or might not be playing this upcoming week. So Mingo is the one guy who I would consider specifically for this week if you're in one of these deeper leagues and are desperate for a wide receiver. The Panthers are playing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So that's been a big reason why I'm considering Mingo right now, is for those leagues where you're desperate for a wide receiver and just need someone who is going to be on the field and hopefully seeing some targets and is in a good matchup. So Mingo fits that. And then we also know that they are made changes to the coaching staff. So there is a chance that the new coaching staff might favor Mingo more than the previous coaching staff was. So there's a chance that he could start doing better because of that and coming off his best game. But there is also a chance that they might rotate their wide receivers more than they've been doing in the past. So a little bit risky there. But if you are that desperate for a wide receiver, you'll need to take a risk regardless.
Yeah, and I mean it's for deeper leagues too, right? Like that's the thing you're looking for here, and I mean he's had at least 5 targets in 3 straight games. Like you said, led the team in receiving this past week, but it's a team looking to the future here, obviously. So Mingo needs to kind of showcase his ability here. Hopefully, he's had the playing time all year, but now is a good time to start showing that he can be a key contributor for this team beyond this year. So he's just been fairly quiet with that playing time most of the year. Offense obviously hasn't been great, but some of that's been on him as well. But there's definitely some potential there for those deeper leagues, like you said, and a nice matchup this week. Okay, another waiver wire wide receiver here to pair with one of our waiver wire quarterbacks, who hopefully he's okay dealing with that injury. Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints, rostered in 32.9% of ESPN leagues.
Yeah, he's someone that we like in particular because Michael Thomas is now an injured reserve, but now Shaheed is also injured. Unlikely to play this week, so that's not a great sign, but I think Shaheed could be pretty big for fantasy leagues, assuming he is able to come back sooner rather than later. We did see before his injury in this game that they were getting him even more involved in the offense. He played 9 of the team's first 11 snaps on the first 2 drives. So Shaheed was a bit more of a rotational player throughout this year, but it seemed like with Thomas out, they were ready to have him be one of the clear top 2 wide receivers on the team. His target rate was fairly high 2 weeks ago when Thomas suffered his injury and was very high this week as well, before the injuries started affecting him. So I think Shaheed, he needs to get healthy, but I think once he is healthy, given the Saints' injuries to the wide receiver position elsewhere and with the schedule they have, I think Shaheed could be a fantasy starter. But again, not someone you can rely on this week. And there's a chance his injury could affect him for more than 1 week. So a risky player, but I think someone who could pay off big time if he does end up getting healthy.
Yeah, and hopefully he does, right? And hopefully this is just the 1 week thing. And I'm sure he'll be on the list next week as well if it isn't a serious injury too, right? It adds a little, with Michael Thomas on IR, we at least get a little bit of a production floor to his potential, right? To make those big plays. And then all of a sudden, he becomes a very enticing fantasy option on a weekly basis. So there is enough to like about Rashid Shaheed that hopefully when he's healthy, he could be somebody that we're putting in fantasy lineups here for the rest of the season. Last name on the wide receiver list, another rookie wide receiver. It is Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals, who is rostered in just 6.4% of ESPN leagues. We know that he missed the past 2 weeks. He's only had the one game with Kyler Murray, but still there's some potential there for him in this offense.
Yeah, we've talked about him for several weeks at this point, and just excited about what he can potentially do with Murray once they do start playing. And the good news is Murray has been playing decently well so far this season. Could very well be a top 10 quarterback for fantasy purposes the rest of the season. Decent schedule over the rest of the year, not a perfect schedule, but still better than most wide receivers. And he just needs to get healthy with that shoulder injury that's kept him out these past couple weeks. So hopefully Wilson is able to get healthy. Hopefully he gets back to his usual amount of playing time, even though Greg Dortch has been playing decently well with Wilson out. But hopefully Wilson gets back to his playing time and as a deep threat is able to make some big plays with Murray. With Murray at quarterback.
Yeah, that would be nice to see for sure. All right, let's go to the tight end position here, and we'll start with a guy that was the tight end one. This past week, he had 11 targets, 9 catches, 120 yards. Pat Fryermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers, rostered in 41.8% of ESPN leagues.
Yeah, this one felt good since we've been including him on this tight end list for a while now, even before he came back from the injury, knowing that he was capable of having big games. So this was excellent to see him get his 100 yards. His playing time really didn't change all that much. Still isn't playing as much as we saw at times, either earlier this year or at times last year. But the Steelers are fine rotating him out significantly, primarily in run situations, which means he doesn't get as many routes as some other tight ends, but still gets targeted on enough routes to make up for it, and was targeted on 44% of his routes this week. So not really expecting him to get targeted on 40% of routes again anytime soon, but the schedule is fairly nice for him. According to our strength of schedule tool, fourth best schedule for tight ends over the rest of the year, ninth best during the fantasy playoffs. And a lot of those teams that have excellent schedules for tight ends are those teams that have like 3-man rotations, 4-man rotations at tight end. So not a lot of tight ends will be taking advantage of the great matchups they have. So I think Fryermuth can be a fantasy starter over the rest of the way, especially with some of the injuries we've had at tight end. Some other guys that we've considered top 10 tight ends really haven't been producing much recently. So I think Fryermuth can be a pretty big factor the rest of the season. So hopefully he's available in your league, especially if you've been hurting at tight end or your tight end that you've been starting hasn't been working out for you.
Yeah, I like it. Another name on the list is one we talked about last week as well. It's Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, we know Mark Andrews on injured reserve here. Ravens have a bye week in week 13, but still rest of season. Isaiah Likely, a decent option here. And we got to see his, I guess, second game of the season now without Mark Andrews, and still feel very encouraged about Isaiah Likely going forward here, Nate.
Yeah, was a lot of kind of what we expected in this first fall game without Andrews, since Andrews was injured fairly early on in week 11. So we saw likely play almost that entire game. Playing time is pretty much what we expected. He basically didn't leave the field in 11 personnel or 12 personnel. The Ravens use a decent amount of 20 personnel, which means no tight end on the field. That's typically how Andrews got his break, and that's similarly how Likely got his break. The only difference in how Andrews and Likely saw their playing time is in 21 personnel. Andrews was playing roughly 80% of the time in 21 personnel, where Likely split that workload with Charlie Kolar. So that's typically a run situation anyway, so not a huge deal. He ended the day with 4 receptions for 40 receiving yards. Not a great game, and against the Chargers defense, you would have kind of hoped for a little bit better game, but in terms of tight ends off the waiver wire, he's the one that's a clear starter. There are plenty of other players in rotations, not seeing nearly as many routes. So I think Likely has a higher floor than a lot of other tight ends off the waiver wire and has more upside just based on what we know this Ravens offense is capable of doing and what we saw from Likely at times last year.
Nice. Yeah, for sure. All right, next name on the list, and look who is back. It is Chigoziem Okonkwo. Look, hey, he's back on here, Nate. You're feeling a little bit better about him. I know we had the Josh Wiley scare a little bit a couple weeks ago as well, but again, could be a nice matchup this week with 6 teams on a bye. How you feeling about Chig Okonkwo this week?
This is another one of those cases where I'm adding a player to the list specifically for the matchup this week. It was a case where I was trying to put things together and then realizing so many players either are injured or have bye weeks. And with the 6 teams on bye weeks this week, I knew I needed to include a tight end who is available in a lot of leagues since there are so many tight ends that are on bye weeks this week. So Okonkwo is coming off of a decent game, caught more passes and I think had a season high in receiving yards this past week, but his was still part of a rotation. They're still using 4 different tight ends with Wiley taking a decent amount of that receiving role as well. The big thing here is the Titans are playing the Indianapolis Colts this week. Indianapolis has allowed the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends this season. So a good matchup for him, a chance for him to at least get a couple more catches, put up a decent amount of yards. So not someone that I'm really high on for the rest of the season. It's just specifically, I know there are plenty of tight ends that have a bye week this week. And so plenty of fantasy managers might be desperate for one if you don't have one on your bench. So Okonkwo is someone who is available in a lot of leagues and can be a 1 week filler.
Let's hope so. Let's hope Chiggy can get back on track here. All right, last name on the list. It is Greg Dulcich of the Denver Broncos, rostered in about 5% of ESPN League. We've only seen him in 2 games all year. Last time we saw him, I think, was week 6 or so. But expecting Greg Dulcich back here, Nate, for the last part of the season.
I'm at least hopeful he is. He kind of fits the same category as some of those running backs that are handcuffs that we talked about at the end of the running backs. It's just if you're at a point of the season where you aren't really using your bench players for any other reason, then it's good to pick up players who have a lot of upside, but a very low chance of reaching that upside. And this is one of those situations where he's missed most of the season, but he was putting up pretty respectable numbers as a rookie. The Broncos could use another weapon in the passing game. We don't know exactly when he will be back from injury, but the Broncos have one of the better schedules for tight ends in the fantasy playoffs. So he has some good matchups. So a lot of things need to go right. He needs to get healthy. He needs to get the playing time when he is healthy and needs to be able to take advantage of that playing time. But if those things happen, then he could be a top 8 fantasy tight end during the fantasy playoffs, where a lot of other tight ends, we know exactly what they are, what they're capable of. It's going to be the same situation that they've been in all season long. So you know that they're not going to be a fantasy starter. They would need to have just a random good week that you wouldn't be able to see coming. So this is just an example of if you want to take a shot on a player on your bench because you aren't happy with your tight end situation, he is someone that has very high upside with a low chance of reaching that upside.
I like it. Yeah, and look, Broncos probably the hottest team in the NFL right now as well. So maybe getting Dulcich back is just another weapon to add to the offense there. And yeah, could be somebody that we never know. Maybe surprises people here down the stretch. All right, let us wrap up our waiver wire targets for this week. We do have a question from the comment section, Nate. We want to put that up here to close out the show before we go into our non-fantasy football draft here to close out the show. But the question comes in from Josh, who asks, would you trade Demario Douglas and Christian Kirk for Amon-Ra St. Brown? It's a 20-team PPR. He's got Lamar Jackson, Jonathan Taylor, Aaron Jones, Tyreek Hill, DJ Moore, Travis Kelce, and Christian Kirk. Decent bench assets as well with Demario Douglas, Dontavian Wicks, Gerald Everett, and Jameson Williams. That is a nice squad to put together here for a 20-team league. So how are you feeling about this potential move here, Nate?
Think I would definitely take him on Raw. He's been so incredibly consistent this season, week in and week out, where Douglas has the injury right now. Kirk's been a little more up and down, especially with Zay Jones back and Calvin Ridley playing better these past couple weeks. So I would definitely get him on Raw. I think he's going to be a much better asset on the team, even though you might be starting Douglas and Kirk at times, but Amon-Ra and some other players still going to be better than Douglas and Kirk.
I like it. Yeah, I always looking to upgrade, and yeah, getting an Amon-Ra St. Brown in there as well would be very nice. Josh has another question. Josh also in a 16-team PPR league here, and he wants to know: would you trade Jamar Chase? I guess that's Breece Hall, Keaton Mitchell, and Khalil Herbert for Keenan Allen and Justin Jefferson? So again, 16-team PPR roster. He has Will Levis, Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, Isaiah Likely, Breece Hall, and Khalil Herbert on the bench.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we got so many good players on one roster. I'm assuming this is a dynasty league where things have gone very well, although ideally you would have said dynasty league. But yeah, I probably would trade if you can get Keenan Allen and Justin Jefferson at this point. But
there you go. Nice job, Josh. Building a very strong roster there in some deep leagues. You love to see that. And it is redraft, he says. So there you go. So just did an excellent job drafting there and building that team throughout the league. So very good job. All right. That is going to wrap up the fantasy football portion of the podcast. Nate, it is time for another 5-round draft here as we go head to head in random things drafting extravaganza. We still don't really have like a solid name for this thing. So we last time we did the best NFL players to ever wear the numbers 1 to 10. So I win that one. So you get the first overall pick here, and we're going to purple characters this time. So oh, we got another question in here. Hold on. What's all right, Peter, you got it. Hey, there you go. You got an IDP question. Myles Garrett is questionable. Is Jonathan Greenard a good pickup or George Karlaftis? Okay, so yeah, Myles Garrett day to day with the shoulder injury. It sounds like he at least has a shot to play this week. Greenard has been fine. I think the one that I would probably look at is George Karlaftis. I'm going to look at matchups really quickly here this week because these guys are. Karlaftis hasn't been amazing as far as pass rush metrics go, but he has played a ton, which has been really nice. So it's given him some opportunity there. So Packers offensive line has been pretty good, solid, but I still think I like George Karlaftis this week just for overall playing time. He played, I think, something like 86% of defensive snaps this past week. So I would be going Karlaftis if you need a backup for Myles Garrett. If Myles Garrett plays, hard to bench him though. That is a tough one to sit. So I think I'd still be starting Myles Garrett if he's active. All right, now back to the 5-round draft, and people still feel free to drop questions in there, and if you have them, we'll answer them here as we draft. But best purple characters, Nate. This one was tough. You've been on a kind of a winning streak here with the color characters. I think you've won 2 in a row on the color side. I think I can't remember exactly. Right, yeah, sounds about right. So you get the first overall pick here. Did you have any trouble finding purple characters? Because I kind of did.
Oh yeah, since we've gone mostly with characters who are that color, but also some that are just very associated with that color. So that gave at least a couple more options here. And with the first pick, there are characters that are purple that are a little more for children, and a lot of characters who are associated with the color purple. But there is at least one character who is purple that we can be a fan of, and that's Thanos. In the MCU, the big villain of the first big saga of the MCU, also purple in the comics, which helps. And sometimes if there is a purple character in the comics and they adapt them for live action, they don't always stay quite as purple, but Thanos definitely fits in the purple character.
He absolutely does. Yeah, this was a very good pick, obviously. So my pick for purple character also from comic books, and I mean the Joker is going to be my purple character. He's got the purple suit, right? That's what he's most known for. Obviously, he's worn other things in there as well, but he could definitely be associated with the color purple here. And yeah, interesting. We got 2 comic book villains that are purple. Not a ton of heroes wearing the color purple, but there are a couple we might get to in a little bit. But I feel pretty good about the Joker here. It was either him or Thanos that I knew I was going to get here at 2. So yeah, feel okay about it.
Those were my 2, but my tiebreaker was just Thanos is purple, where the Joker is just associated with the color purple. So that was my tiebreaker there. The next one I'm going to go with, just because I want him on my team, is Waluigi. Waluigi, the Mario character who has been one of my main characters, particularly in Mario Tennis. Played tennis back in the day, so enjoyed Mario Tennis. And Waluigi with his long arms, I enjoyed him in that game. I've used him plenty of the time in Mario Kart as well. So Waluigi, not always the best character in Mario Kart, but I still enjoy him. So wanted to make sure that I at least got him on my team.
Yeah, that is a strong pick. I had Waluigi third on my list here, and now the rest is kind of a jumble, and I don't really have a specific order for it. So I think I'm gonna go with Darkwing Duck. If you remember the
Yep,
animated series from back in the
that's good.
like the 90s, that was a very popular one for me as a kid. So I always enjoyed Darkwing Duck. He was like a superhero in there as well. So yeah, Darkwing Duck gonna be my second overall pick here.
There. Next, I'm gonna go with Grimace, the character from the McDonald's commercials and whatever else McDonald's has done with Grimace. And with all that stuff with Grimace Shakes this summer, I'm just hoping that I can jump on those viral moments from like what 4 or 5 months ago at this point. But still, very much a purple character though. So wanted to make sure that I got a decent number of people on my team that are actually purple and not just associated with the color purple.
Yeah, the Grimace is a good one, and I'm not usually a big fan of like the meme trends that go on, but the Grimace shake meme that was going around was definitely one of the funniest and more creative memes that I've seen out there. It was really good stuff by the people that put those together. Always made me laugh. So Grimace, yeah, Grimace, a nice call there. All right, my third pick. Oh man. Okay, so now yeah, we're really tough here. I'm gonna go. You know what? Let me know if this one counts. I'm gonna go with Donatello from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He is known as the Purple Ninja Turtle, right? He's got the purple bandana. Obviously, Donatello. He loves machines, but that is gonna be my third pick if it's allowed. I feel like it's associated
Yeah,
with the color purple. Yeah,
we'll let it go. With the green characters, we got so many complaints that we didn't include any
right.
Ninja Turtles with green, but it's like, which Ninja Turtle do we choose as the Ninja Turtles? If we take one, then we feel like we're leaving the other three out. But in this case, I think it works out.
Nice, nice.
But you were asking if something counts, so I'm going to go with the count from Sesame Street for
Oh,
my
nice.
next pick, going with the word count there.
Very
But
nice.
I there are plenty of characters for children that are associated with the color purple, which it's surprising that there are so many specifically for children. Where all these other characters we could think of, plenty of people that weren't necessarily for quite as young of an audience. But I think the count is fun, and there are also videos of the count censored on the internet, and those are also fun. So
Those actually are really funny. I forgot about those videos. Yeah, nice job. All right, so oh man, now I'm thinking about those videos and yeah. All right, my next pick as far as purple characters go, I think I will go with if you ever watched the 60s Batman series with Adam West and Burt Ward, there was also a Batgirl on that show. It was Yvonne Craig. She wore a purple bat suit, and yeah, I was always a big fan of Yvonne Craig. I'll leave it at that, but she'll be my fourth pick here.
I will also go with a bit of an older character, not quite that old, but I will go back to the 90s. I've used Power Rangers as my picks for a while since I'm a big time Power Rangers fan, and I feel like this is another good opportunity. And I'm going to go with Ivan Ooze. If you remember from the first Power Rangers movie,
Hmm.
Ivan Ooze was the main villain in that, very purple character in that as well. So, got another character who is definitely purple, but leaving a number of characters available at this point. But I want to make sure that I get a Power Rangers at least every couple of ones of these drafts.
Fair. You got to represent. And yeah, Ivan Ooze, I like that. All right, my last pick here, and like you said, yeah, there's still a couple options that we didn't touch on. Yeah, it's tough. There was like some Pokemon in there. I think Mewtwo was one of them. I
Yeah.
might maybe go there. I also, but you know what? I'm gonna keep going back to the childhood here because I got Darkwing Duck, I got Donatello, I got Yvonne Craig's Batgirl. I'm gonna go with Spyro the Dragon from the PlayStation series. If anybody ever played the original PlayStation, I'm sure they've remade those games and had like different versions of them beyond PlayStation One. But that was one of my top PS1 games was Spyro the Dragon. So we'll put him in there and show him some love. So That gives you Thanos, Waluigi, Grimace, the Count from Sesame Street, and Ivan Ooze from Power Rangers. I got the Joker, Darkwing Duck, Donatello, Yvonne Craig's Batgirl, and Spyro the Dragon. So we'll see if I remember to get that up this week. No, I'm kidding. I will try to get that up this week so that people could vote on the Twitter poll. But that is going to wrap up today's episode of the PFF Fantasy Podcast. We thank you all very much for tuning in and listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the PFF Fantasy YouTube channel while you're here. We greatly appreciate that. Nate, thank you for coming up this big list of players for people to choose from heading into a very crucial part of the fantasy football season. So for people that are looking for more of you and your work, what else do you have up on pff.com this week?
Sure. So I have the recaps to all of the games that have happened this past week. Also have rest of season rankings that went up today. We just went over the waivers. As long as I'm not dealing with too many people in my mentions mad that we didn't pick Barney, I will have the fantasy rankings for this upcoming week up later today, and then in article form tomorrow, and then it'll be starts it on Thursday as usual.
Yeah, you're gonna be fighting off a lot of Barney believers in the mentions this week. But I was never a big fan of Barney, but that definitely would be a top purple character that came to mind there. And then, yeah, as for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report up on the website this afternoon. That'll have all of our IDP waiver wire targets in there as well. And then, yeah, I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly IDP preview podcast. And we will be back with Kate on Thursday previewing the offensive side of the ball. We didn't do it last week because of Thanksgiving. So apologies for missing that one. But again, thank you all for listening. And until next time, peace out.